The Montana wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers as the train whistle pierced the afternoon quiet of Pinecrest Valley. Sarah Mitchell gathered her skirts with one hand, the other clutching a worn leather valise containing everything she owned of value. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, she towered over the other passengers, disembarking onto the newly constructed platform. She felt the familiar weight of stairs as she stepped down from the train car, ducking instinctively, despite the doorway being tall enough to accommodate her height. The journey from Philadelphia had taken nearly a week. Days of uncomfortable seats, soot-stained air, and curious glances from fellow travelers. Sarah had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind during the long trek westward. Edward Wilson awaited somewhere on this platform, the man whose earnest letters had convinced her to leave behind the remnants of her life in the East and journey to this remote frontier settlement. 8 months of correspondence had revealed a man of apparent intelligence, ambition, and kindness, a shopkeeper seeking a wife of refinement and education to help establish his growing business in newly prosperous Pinecrest Valley. In his letters, Edward had praised her background as a schoolteacher, her appreciation for literature, her thoughtful perspectives on current events. Sarah had carefully described her interests, her hopes for the future, her desire for a partner who valued her mind. What she had deliberately omitted was her height. Years of experience had taught her that this single physical attribute overshadowed all else in the minds of potential suitors. In Philadelphia, she had watched as men who initially found her fascinating retreated when they realized they would need to look upward to meet her gaze. Sarah scanned the modest platform, noting the newly painted Pinecrest Valley sign hanging. From the station house, a cluster of people waited, families reuniting, a drummer with sample cases, and several men in varying degrees of frontier attire. One figure stood apart, his posture crisp, his clothing more Eastern than Western. His polished boots and carefully trimmed mustache marked him immediately as someone who maintained Eastern standards despite his Western location. "Miss Mitchell," he called, approaching with a confident stride. Sarah nodded, straightening to her full height after the hours of cramped travel. "Mr. Wilson, I presume?" She watched the transformation of his expression, the initial smile of greeting freezing, then faltering as his eyes traveled upward and upward still to finally meet her gaze. His Adam's apple bobbed noticeably as he swallowed. "Miss Mitchell," he repeated, his voice maintaining its composure even as his eyes betrayed his shock. You've arrived safely. That's excellent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Edward Wilson had imagined this meeting differently. Sarah could see it in the rigid control he now exerted over his features, in the careful distance he maintained as he gestured toward the street. "My carriage is waiting. You must be tired after your journey." Sarah followed, her steps measured and deliberate. She had become adept at moving gracefully despite her height, at occupying space unapologetically, even as the world seemed determined to make her feel too large, too noticeable, too much. The street beyond the station revealed Pinecrest Valley in full, a growing settlement nestled between towering mountain ranges. The main street boasted several brick buildings among the wooden structures, evidence of the town's growing prosperity. Horses and wagons moved along the dusty thoroughfare, and Sarah noted the curious glances from passers-by. Edward led her to a smart black buggy and offered his hand with mechanical courtesy to help her in. His touch was impersonal, his gaze directed somewhere past her shoulder. "Pinecrest has grown considerably since the railroad came through," he said as they set off, his tone shifting to something resembling a tour guide's practiced recitation. "My store, Wilson's Mercantile, supplies most of the region. We carry everything from farming implements to the finest fabrics from back east." Sarah listened, noting how carefully he avoided meeting her eyes. "Your letters described your business endeavors quite vividly," she offered. "It sounds as though you've established yourself well here." "Yes, indeed." Edward flicked the reins, urging the horse to a slightly faster pace. "The town council has recently granted approval for an expansion. I'll be adding a full haberdashery section and expanding our household goods." The conversation continued in this vein as they drove through town, Edward pointing out buildings of note, Sarah making appropriate responses, neither addressing the stiffness that had settled between them. The mercantile, when they reached it, was indeed impressive for a frontier town. A large two-story structure with plate glass windows displaying merchandise artfully arranged. A painted sign proclaiming Wilson's Mercantile in elaborate script, and hung above the entrance. "My living quarters are above the store," Edward explained, as he helped her down from the buggy. "However, I've arranged for you to stay at Cooper's boarding house until we determine how to proceed." The careful phrasing told Sarah everything. The rejection was coming. It was merely a question of timing and approach. She had experienced this before, the careful withdrawal, the polite distancing, the eventual explanation that she was not what had been expected or desired. "I see," she said simply. A flicker of discomfort crossed Edward's face. "Mrs. Cooper is a respectable widow. Her establishment is the finest in Pinecrest. I merely thought you would appreciate the opportunity to rest and acclimate to our town before making any permanent arrangements." "How thoughtful of you," Sarah replied, unable to keep a note of dryness from her tone. Edward cleared his throat, glancing up and down the street as if seeking escape. "I have business to attend to this afternoon, a shipment requiring my personal inventory. Perhaps we could meet for supper at the hotel restaurant, 7 o'clock. "That would be suitable," Sarah agreed, knowing with certainty that the supper would involve the gentle dissolution of their arrangement. Relief visibly washed over Edward's features. "Excellent! Robert," he called to a young man exiting the store, "please escort Miss Mitchell to Cooper's boarding house and carry her valise." The young clerk approached, his eyes widening slightly as he registered Sarah's height, but to his credit, his expression remained pleasant. "Yes, sir. Right this way, Miss Mitchell." As they walked the 3 blocks to the boarding house, Sarah took the opportunity to observe Pinecrest Valley more carefully. The town had a purposeful energy about it. New construction alongside established buildings, people moving with the brisk efficiency of a place experiencing growth. She noticed women in fashionable Eastern dresses alongside others in more practical frontier attire. Wagons loaded with lumber and supplies passed by, and in the distance, the newly constructed church spire rose against the backdrop of mountains. "Cooper's is just ahead, ma'am," the young clerk offered. "Been here since before the railroad. Mrs. Cooper keeps the cleanest house in the territory, so folks say." The boarding house was a 2-story white clapboard structure with bright blue shutters and a wide, welcoming porch. Pots of bright geraniums flanked the entrance, and a hand-painted sign announced Cooper's in simple, elegant lettering. As they approached, the front door opened to reveal a plump woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun. "You must be Miss Mitchell," she called out with genuine warmth. "Mr. Wilson sent word you'd be coming." "I'm Margaret Cooper," Maggie to most folks with sense enough to be friendly. Sarah found herself responding to the woman's unaffected welcome. "Sarah Mitchell, thank you for accommodating me on such short notice." "Nonsense. Always happy to have a new face, especially one bringing some proper Eastern refinement to our little corner of the territory." Maggie's eyes twinkled as she looked up at Sarah. "My word, the air must be mighty fine up where you're standing." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Come in, Robert, you can set that valise just inside and tell Mr. Wilson his instructions have been carried out proper." The young man deposited Sarah's bag with a polite nod and hurried back toward the mercantile. Maggie ushered Sarah inside to a parlor furnished with a surprising degree of comfort and taste. A well-used piano stood in one corner, comfortable chairs arranged near a riverstone fireplace, and bookshelves lined one wall. "You'll be wanting to freshen up after that dreadful train journey," Maggie said, leading Sarah upstairs. "I've given you the corner room, gets the morning sun, and has the tallest bed in the house. My late husband, Frank, was 6'4" and couldn't abide his feet hanging off the end of a bed." The thoughtful consideration brought an unexpected lump to Sarah's throat. "That's very kind of you." "Not kindness, just sense," Maggie replied, matter-of-factly. "No point in having a guest uncomfortable when there's a solution right at hand." The room was indeed lovely, spacious, with a large window overlooking the mountains to the west. The promised bed was substantial, with a colorful quilt stretched across its surface. A washstand with a porcelain basin, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk completed the furnishings. "Supper's at 6 for boarders," Maggie informed her. "Though, I understand you're meeting Mr. Wilson at the hotel this evening. Rest well, and if you need anything, just holler." Left alone, Sarah finally allowed her composed expression to falter. She sank onto the bed, the exhaustion of travel and emotional strain catching up with her all at once. She had risked everything on this venture. Sold her mother's house, resigned her teaching position, bid farewell to the few friends who had stood by her, all for the promise of a new beginning with a man who had seemed, on paper, to value her for her mind and character. Now she found herself in yet another familiar situation, being viewed as too tall, too imposing, too much. Edward Wilson's reaction had been predictable, though no less disappointing for its predictability. She allowed herself precisely 5 minutes of despair before straightening her shoulders and rising to unpack her meager belongings. By the time 7 o'clock approached, Sarah had bathed, changed into her best dress, a deep navy wool with subtle embroidery at the collar that she had crafted herself, and mentally prepared for the conversation ahead. She had even taken time to reread Edward's letters, noting with irony how many times he had praised her unique perspective and standing above the common crowd, phrases that now took on unintended literal meaning. The hotel restaurant occupied the ground floor of Pinecrest Valley's newest building, a 3-story brick structure with aspirations toward urban sophistication. Crystal gaslights illuminated white-clothed tables, and a small vase of wildflowers adorned each setting. Edward was already seated when Sarah arrived, rising with stiff politeness as she approached. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted her, waiting until she was seated before resuming his own chair. "I trust Mrs. Cooper has made you comfortable?" "Quite," Sarah replied. "She seems a kind woman." "One of our town's treasures," Edward agreed, signaling the waiter. "The trout is excellent here, if you're partial to fish," they ordered, making perfunctory conversation about the town, the journey, the weather, all while avoiding the central issue that hung between them. It wasn't until their plates had been cleared that Edward finally broached the subject that had tensed his shoulders throughout the meal. "Miss Mitchell," he began, carefully folding his napkin beside his plate, "I find myself in an awkward position. Your letters revealed a woman of intelligence and refinement, qualities I greatly admire and seek in a potential wife. But you find my height objectionable," Sarah finished for him, her tone even. Edward had the grace to flush slightly. Not objectionable precisely, merely unexpected and potentially problematic in our particular situation. "How so?" Sarah pressed, though she already knew the answer. "Pinecrest Valley is a growing community with opportunities for advancement. As a businessman with aspirations, Towards civic leadership certain. Appearances must be maintained. He adjusted his cuffs, a nervous gesture. A wife should complement a man's position, not overshadow it. The familiar words stung no less for their predictability. Sarah had heard variations of this sentiment throughout her adult life, from her first courtship at 19 to her last rejected suitor in Philadelphia at 32. "You mean a wife should be physically smaller than her husband," she translated. "She should quite literally look up to him." "You're being rather direct, Miss Mitchell." "I find directness saves time, Mr. Wilson, particularly when the conclusion seems foregone." Edward cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I would never wish to cause offense. Your qualities are admirable, in different circumstances." "Please," Sarah interrupted, raising a hand. "Let's not pretend there are circumstances under which you would find my height acceptable. You needn't soften the blow with false possibilities." Silence fell between them, punctuated by the murmur of conversation from nearby tables and the clink of silverware against china. Sarah was aware of covert glances from other diners, curious about the mismatched pair they presented. Edward, so carefully groomed and conventional, she so unavoidably tall and conspicuous. "What do you intend to do now?" Edward finally asked. It was the question Sarah had been asking herself all afternoon. Her funds were limited, barely sufficient for a return journey if she departed immediately. The teaching position she had resigned would undoubtedly be filled by now, and her mother's house sold to cover debts. "I shall consider my options," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Pinecrest Valley appears to be growing. Perhaps there's need for a school teacher." Edward's expression suggested doubt. "The town has recently hired a schoolmaster, Harvard-educated, for our new schoolhouse." He hesitated, then added, with what seemed genuine regret, "I truly am sorry, Miss Mitchell. The arrangements for your journey will, of course, remain covered as agreed." "You're offering to pay for my return passage," Sarah clarified, a trace of bitterness entering her voice. "It seems the honorable course." Sarah studied the man across from her, his carefully maintained appearance, his evident discomfort, his concern with social standing. She thought of the return journey, the arrival back in Philadelphia with nowhere to go and limited prospects. At 34, starting over yet again seemed an impossible mountain to climb. "I believe I'll stay, at least temporarily," she said, surprising herself with the decision even as she voiced it. "I've traveled a considerable distance to reach Pinecrest Valley. It would seem wasteful to depart without at least exploring what the town might offer." Edward's relief was poorly concealed. "As you wish. Mrs. Cooper's establishment is paid through the week. Beyond that, He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "Please accept this as compensation for your trouble and disappointment." Sarah stared at the envelope, pride warring with practicality. The money would provide breathing room, time to assess her situation and determine a course of action. Pride would feed no one and secure no shelter. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the envelope and tucking it into her reticule. The following morning, Sarah woke early, the eastern light filtering through her window and casting the mountains in golden hues. After breakfast with the other boarders, a retired mining engineer, a young clerk from the bank, and a milliner's assistant, she set out to explore Pinecrest Valley properly. The town revealed itself differently in daylight, its rough edges more apparent alongside its aspirations. Beyond the main street's newer buildings stretched more modest dwellings, cabins and simple clapboard houses where miners, ranch hands, and tradespeople lived. Women hung washing in yards, children chased chickens and dogs, men repaired tools and wagons. It was a working town still finding its identity between frontier outpost and emerging commercial center. Sarah's height drew the usual stares and whispers as she walked, but she held her posture straight, her pace unhurried. Years of unwanted attention had taught her to move through the world as if she belonged in it exactly as she was. A hard one. Composure that served as both armor and assertion. Her wanderings brought her to the town's edge, where Thomas Reed's guide service occupied a sturdy log building. Outside, a young man was cleaning rifles on the porch, while an older Native American man sorted through leather harnesses and saddle gear. There was no sign of Thomas himself. "Good morning," Sarah greeted them, curious about this business so different from any she had encountered in Philadelphia. "I was admiring your establishment." The young man, barely out of his teens, looked up, his eyes widening as he registered her height. "Morning, ma'am. You must be the lady who saved little Mary Wilson yesterday. News travels fast around here." "Indeed it does," Sarah acknowledged. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." "Robert Jenkins, ma'am. And this here is Two Feathers, best tracker this side of the divide." The older man nodded in polite acknowledgement, but continued his work. "Boss ain't here right now, out with a surveyor party. Should be back by nightfall if you was looking for him." "No particular reason," Sarah said, though she felt a flicker of disappointment. "I'm new to Pinecrest and simply exploring." Robert grinned. "Well then, you ought to know the Mountaineer Guide Service is the finest in the territory. We take out hunters, naturalists, survey parties, and them fancy Eastern tourists who want to sketch waterfalls and such." He gestured toward a wooden placard beside the door that read, "Maps, Guides, Equipment, Knowledge." "It seems a useful enterprise," Sarah observed, studying the items visible through the open door. Maps spread on a large table, mounted animal specimens on the walls, shelves of equipment and supplies. "Boss knows every inch of these mountains," Robert said with evident pride. "Government men come all the way from Washington to consult his maps. Even them university professors with their fancy degrees ask his opinion about plants and animals." "You sound proud to work for him." "Saved my life, he did," Robert replied simply. "Found me half dead after Indians attacked our wagon train, everyone else gone. Brought me here, taught me a trade. Been with him 5 years now." Sarah felt a new curiosity about Thomas Reed. "He seems an unusual man." Robert nodded vigorously. "That he is, ma'am. Most educated fellow I know, though he never sets foot in a schoolhouse. Reads them thick books by candlelight after everyone's asleep. Knows Latin and such, though he don't make a show of it like some." He glanced meaningfully toward the town center, suggesting a comparison with someone else, possibly the new schoolmaster Edward had mentioned. The native man, Two Feathers, spoke unexpectedly, his English clear but accented. "Thomas Reed walks with 1 foot in white man's world, 1 foot in the old ways, sees more than most." Before Sarah could respond, a feminine voice called from up the street. "Miss Mitchell, what a delightful surprise to find you here." Sarah turned to see Mrs. Cooper approaching, basket over her arm and a warm smile on her face. "I'm familiarizing myself with Pinecrest," Sarah explained. "It seems a remarkably diverse community." "That it is, though some would prefer it less so," Maggie replied, with a significant glance toward the guide service building. "I've just been to the baker's. Would you care to accompany me to the mercantile? I need fabric for new curtains, and you have such refined taste." Sarah understood the invitation as more than it appeared. Maggie was offering an opportunity to re-encounter Edward Wilson on different terms than their awkward parting the previous evening. She hesitated, uncertain if she wished to face him so soon. "Mr. Wilson is away at the lumber mill this morning," Maggie added, reading her hesitation accurately. "His assistant tends the store on Thursdays." With that assurance, Sarah agreed, bidding farewell to Robert and Two Feathers. As they walked back toward town, Maggie linked her arm companionably through Sarah's, seemingly unbothered by the height difference between them. "I heard about your dinner with Mr. Wilson," Maggie said matter-of-factly. News travels faster than telegram in Pinecrest. I suspected it might, Sarah replied, resigned to being the subject of town gossip. Edward Wilson is a decent enough man in his way, Maggie continued, but limited in vision. He sees the world as it appears in Eastern magazines, all proper proportions and conventional arrangements. He'd have every building in town painted the same respectable shade of white if he could manage it. The assessment matched Sarah's own impression of the mercantile owner. He seems very concerned with appearances. Precisely so, and in doing so, misses the true substance of things. Maggie squeezed Sarah's arm affectionately. His loss, dear. The simple validation from this woman she barely knew loosened something tight in Sarah's chest. Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. Maggie, please. Mrs. Cooper makes me feel like someone's stern aunt. She chuckled. Now I understand you're a former school teacher. Yes, 8 years teaching at a girls' academy in Philadelphia. Maggie murmured thoughtfully. Our new schoolmaster, Mr. Harrington, is finding frontier children somewhat more spirited than he anticipated. He mentioned just yesterday that he's considering an assistant. Sarah's interest quickened. Did he indeed? Might be worth a conversation, Maggie suggested casually. The school is that brick building just beyond the church. Classes dismiss at 3. The possibility of employment, even as an assistant, sparked a cautious hope in Sarah. I shall certainly inquire. They entered Wilson's Mercantile, which bustled with mid-morning customers. A young woman examined fabric bolts, while a ranch wife selected sewing notions. 2 men discussed the merits of different axes near the tool section. The assistant, a bespectacled young man, greeted Maggie with familiar warmth. Mrs. Cooper, your order of coffee arrived on yesterday's train, and those special hairpins you requested from St. Louis. Excellent, Timothy. I'll collect them shortly. First, I need your advice on curtain fabric. Miss Mitchell here has an eye for quality. As Timothy showed them various options, the shop door opened, admitting a petite blonde woman dressed in the latest Eastern fashion. Her appearance caused a subtle ripple of reaction through the store. Customers straightening, conversations. In pausing, the assistant's demeanor shifting from casual to deferential. Miss Hayes, welcome back. Mr. Wilson mentioned you'd returned to Pinecrest. Only temporarily, the woman replied, her voice cultured and pleasant. Father's health requires my attention. Her gaze moved around the store, eventually landing on Sarah with evident curiosity. I don't believe we've met. I'm Charlotte Hayes. Sarah Mitchell, Sarah replied, standing at her full height and observing the now familiar widening of eyes as Charlotte registered their considerable difference in stature. Miss Mitchell arrived yesterday from Philadelphia, Maggie added. She's a former school teacher with excellent credentials. How interesting, Charlotte murmured, studying Sarah with undisguised interest. Philadelphia is so refined compared to our little settlement. What brings you all the way to Pinecrest Valley? The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken curiosity. Sarah could feel the attention of the other customers, all awaiting her response. Clearly, Charlotte Hayes held some significant social position that made her question more than casual conversation. A desire for new horizons, Sarah replied smoothly. Eastern cities can be quite limiting in their own way. Charlotte smiled, accepting the diplomatic answer. Indeed they can. Well, welcome to our community, Miss Mitchell. Perhaps you'll join me for tea sometime soon. I'm staying at my father's house, the white colonial with green shutters just beyond the church. The invitation surprised Sarah, who had expected polite dismissal rather than social inclusion from someone of Charlotte's evident status. That would be lovely, thank you. After Charlotte selected several items and departed, Maggie leaned close to Sarah. Charlotte Hayes is Judge Hayes's daughter, richest family in the county. She was engaged to Edward Wilson until last spring, when she suddenly departed for extended visits to relatives in Boston. And now she's returned, Sarah observed. The coincidence seemed significant. Indeed she has, Maggie replied with a knowing look. Just when Edward had arranged for a mail-order bride. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? The implication was clear. Edward's pursuit of a bride from the East might have been intended to provoke jealousy in his former fiancée. The thought that she might have been merely a pawn in such a scheme sent a flush of anger through Sarah. Well, that certainly clarifies matters, she said stiffly. Maggie patted her arm sympathetically. Don't take it personally, dear. Men like Edward use people like chess pieces, all part of their strategy to win what they consider the game of life. They completed their purchases, and Sarah continued her exploration of Pinecrest, her thoughts troubled by this new information. The afternoon brought her to the schoolhouse, just as children poured from its doors, their voices high and excited in their release from lessons. They scattered like leaves in wind, running toward homes or lingering in small groups to extend their freedom. The schoolmaster emerged last, a thin young man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a harried expression. His suit, though of good quality, bore chalk dust and what appeared to be ink stains on one sleeve. He paused on the steps, removed his spectacles, and pinched the bridge of his nose in a gesture of evident fatigue. Sarah approached, seizing the opportunity Maggie had suggested. "Mr. Harrington, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I understand you might be seeking an assistant." The young man blinked at her, clearly surprised by her height, but too exhausted to register more than mild curiosity. "Miss Mitchell." "Yes. Word travels quickly in Pinecrest." He sighed, replacing his spectacles. "I confess the challenge is greater than anticipated. These children have had minimal formal education. Many can barely read, and their mathematical skills are rudimentary at best. Frontier education often focuses on practical knowledge rather than academic subjects," Sarah observed. "Precisely, but the town council expects Boston standards within a year." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. "Would you care to come inside? We might discuss your qualifications." The schoolroom was large and well lit, with rows of desks facing a blackboard. Maps hung on the walls alongside charts of letters and numbers. It was a fine facility by frontier standards, though the scattered papers and upturned inkwell on the teacher's desk suggested recent chaos. "You've taught previously?" Mr. Harrington inquired, hastily straightening his desk. 8 years at Millfield Academy for Young Ladies in Philadelphia, Sarah confirmed. "Before that, 2 years as a private governess. I'm proficient in literature, composition, mathematics through algebra, history, geography, and basic natural sciences." Mr. Harrington's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Impressive credentials. May I ask what brings you to Pinecrest Valley? We're hardly a center of academic opportunity." Sarah hesitated, unwilling to reveal the embarrassing truth of her mail-order bride status. Personal circumstances required a change. "I find frontier regions interesting. The opportunity to bring education to communities in development." "Admirable," Mr. Harrington said, though his tone suggested skepticism. "The position would involve assisting with the younger children primarily, basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. The salary is modest, $20 monthly. The school board requires references, of course. I can provide those, though it will take time for letters to arrive from Philadelphia." Mr. Harrington considered this. "Perhaps a trial period, while we await verification. The need is rather urgent, particularly with the younger students. Their energy is considerable." Relief flooded through Sarah. Employment, even temporary, would provide not only income but purpose. "I would be delighted to accept those terms." "Excellent. We can begin tomorrow, if that suits. 8 o'clock sharp, the morning. Session focuses on the younger children. which would be your primary responsibility. They discussed details of the curriculum and Sarah's specific duties before parting with a handshake that sealed their arrangement. As she walked back toward the boarding house, Sarah felt a lightness that had been absent since her arrival. She had secured employment using her actual skills and training, not as anyone's wife or ornament, but as an educator in her own right. The sun was lowering toward the western mountains as she approached Cooper's, casting long shadows across the street. A familiar tall figure stood speaking with Maggie on the porch, Thomas Reed, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden light. He turned as Sarah approached, his expression warming in recognition. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted her, removing his hat. "Mrs. Cooper was just telling me about your educational background, impressive credentials." "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Sarah replied, noting that his height still gave her the novel experience of looking slightly upward to meet his gaze. "I've secured a position assisting at the school, beginning tomorrow." "Harrington hired you? Good. He needs help. Boys drowning in there." Thomas's direct assessment matched Sarah's own impression of the overwhelmed schoolmaster. "Those kids need someone who understands more than Latin conjugations." "Thomas brings us fresh venison," Maggie explained, indicating a cloth-wrapped package. "Best hunter in the territory." "A trade for Mrs. Cooper's excellent pies," Thomas clarified with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "A fair exchange in my estimation." "Will you stay for supper, Thomas?" Maggie invited. "We're having stew and there's plenty." Sarah found herself hoping he would accept, curious to learn more about this unusual man who seemed so at ease with himself and the wilderness he navigated. "I'd be honored," Thomas replied, "though I should clean up first. Been tracking all day with the survey party." "Nonsense," Maggie dismissed his concern. "We're not so formal here. Besides, Sarah might enjoy hearing about the territory from someone who knows it better than most maps." Inside, Maggie's other boarders were already gathered in the dining room. The retired mining engineer, Mr. Hollister, the bank clerk, young Peter Grant, and the milliner's assistant, Miss Weber. They greeted Thomas with evident familiarity and Sarah with polite curiosity. Over Maggie's excellent venison stew and freshly baked bread, conversation flowed easily. Thomas described the survey party's work mapping potential routes for a new road to connect Pinecrest with settlements further north. Mr. Hollister argued passionately for a route that would facilitate mining operations, while Thomas advocated for one that would cause less disruption to wildlife and water sources. "The mountains don't belong to us, Hollister," Thomas stated firmly. "We're guests here, not owners. Take what you need, but with respect." "Spoken like a man who's spent too much time with the Blackfoot," Mr. Hollister retorted, though his tone held more friendly disagreement than genuine rancor. "Progress requires resources, Reed. Those mountains are full of copper and silver just waiting to build America's future. And when they're empty, what future then?" Thomas countered. He turned to Sarah, including her in the discussion. "What was your impression of our fair town today, Miss Mitchell, as someone with fresh eyes?" Sarah considered the question. "Seriously, I see a community in transition between its frontier origins and its aspirations toward civilization. The tension between those identities seems to define much of what I observed." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Precisely so. Pinecrest stands at a crossroads, figuratively and literally. The decisions made now will determine what sort of place it becomes. That's why the town council's vote next month on the conservation ordinance is so crucial," Peter Grant interjected. "Mr. Wilson and Judge Hayes are leading the opposition, of course." "Conservation ordinance?" Sarah inquired. "A proposal to limit hunting and timber harvesting in certain areas," Thomas explained. "Creating protected lands similar to what they've done at Yellowstone. I've been advocating for it, alongside Dr. Foster and a few others. While Edward Wilson advocates unrestricted development, Maggie added with evident disapproval. He sees $ where Thomas sees wilderness worth preserving. Micah, the conversation turned to other town matters, but Sarah found her attention repeatedly drawn to Thomas. Unlike Edward Wilson's careful self-presentation, Thomas seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin, his opinions expressed directly, but without arrogance. When he spoke of the mountains, his deep voice took on a quality of reverence that suggested a connection beyond mere commercial interest or aesthetic appreciation. After dinner, while Maggie served apple pie and coffee, Thomas turned to Sarah. I understand you were a teacher in Philadelphia. What subjects did you most enjoy teaching? Literature and natural sciences, Sarah replied without hesitation. I find they complement each other. Literature helps us understand the human experience, while science illuminates the natural world. An enlightened perspective, Thomas said approvingly. I've quite a collection of books on both subjects. You'd be welcome to borrow any that interest you. You're a reader, Mr. Reed, Sarah asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed to blend frontier ruggedness with unexpected intellectual depths. Thomas, please, he corrected gently. And yes, reading keeps the mind sharp during long winter evenings. My cabin has more books than furniture, much to the amusement of my fellow guides. Thomas has the finest private library in the territory, Maggie informed Sarah. Everything from Shakespeare to Darwin. Darwin? Sarah's interest quickened. I found his writings fascinating, though somewhat controversial in Philadelphia circles. The natural world confirms his theories daily, Thomas replied. I've observed natural selection firsthand among mountain sheep and elk populations. He hesitated, then added, if you're interested, I'm guiding a naturalist from Boston next week, Professor Lawrence from Harvard. He's documenting plant species unique to our mountain valleys. You'd be welcome to join the expedition. The cave invitation surprised and intrigued Sarah. That sounds fascinating, though I'm not sure I'd be properly equipped for mountain travel. We could remedy that, Thomas assured her. Mrs. Cooper knows a seamstress who could alter suitable clothing, and my service has appropriate boots and outerwear for various conditions. The prospect of exploring the wilderness beyond Pinecrest was tempting, not just for the scientific interest, but for the opportunity to escape the scrutiny of town society, if only temporarily. I would enjoy that very much, Sarah decided, assuming it doesn't interfere with my school duties. The expedition leaves Saturday morning and returns Sunday evening, Thomas said, clearly pleased by her acceptance. The area we're visiting is just a half-day's ride, a valley with several unique ecosystems within close proximity. As the evening concluded and Thomas prepared to depart, he paused on the porch with Sarah. The night had turned cool. Stars emerging in brilliant clarity above the mountains. The school is fortunate to have you, he said sincerely. Those children will benefit from your knowledge and perspective. I appreciate your confidence, Sarah replied. I confess, I'm somewhat nervous about tomorrow. Frontier children may be quite different from the young ladies I taught in Philadelphia. Thomas smiled. They're more direct, certainly, and less concerned with propriety, but they're eager to learn when the subject is presented with genuine enthusiasm. He gazed toward the mountains, their silhouettes black against the star-filled sky. This land shapes people differently, rewards different qualities than Eastern society values. What qualities does it reward? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Resilience, adaptability, honesty. He looked down at her, his expression thoughtful in the porch lamplight. The wilderness doesn't care about social conventions or appearances. It responds to what's genuine and discards what's false. The observation resonated with Sarah, who had spent so much of her life navigating social expectations that conflicted with her physical reality. "That sounds rather liberating." "It can be," Thomas agreed, "for those willing to see themselves and others as they truly are, rather than as society dictates they should be." He replaced his hat and stepped back. "Good night, Miss Mitchell. I look forward to our expedition next weekend." As Sarah watched his tall figure disappear into the darkness, she reflected on the stark contrast between her two primary acquaintances in Pinecrest Valley, Edward Wilson, so concerned with Eastern propriety and social standing, and Thomas Reed, who seemed to evaluate people and situations based on their genuine nature rather than their adherence to convention. For a woman who had never fit conventional expectations, the difference was not merely philosophical, but deeply personal. In Thomas's wilderness-shaped worldview, perhaps her height might be seen not as a flaw to be minimized or overcome, but simply as an aspect of who she was, neither good nor bad, but simply true. That night, as she prepared for her first day of teaching, Sarah found herself contemplating not just her immediate future in Pinecrest, but a new possibility, that in this frontier community, so different from Philadelphia society, she might finally find a place where she could stand at her full height, literally and figuratively, without apology or accommodation. Sarah's first day as assistant teacher proved more challenging than she had anticipated. The schoolroom held 38 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, with widely varying levels of education. Some of the older boys from ranching, families attended sporadically, pulled away by the demands of seasonal work. Young girls in calico dresses sat beside the children of merchants in their finer attire, all united by the frontier's democratic approach to education. Mr. Harrington had assigned her the younger students, 12 children under 10 years old who occupied the front rows of desks. Their energy seemed boundless, their attention spans considerably less so. By mid-morning, Sarah had abandoned her carefully prepared lesson on basic letters and adapted to a more interactive approach, leading the children outside to practice writing letters in the dirt with sticks. "You're quite resourceful, Miss Mitchell," Mr. Harrington commented during the noon recess as children consumed their packed lunches in the schoolyard. "I hadn't considered taking the lesson outdoors." "Children this age learn better through movement and tactile experiences," Sarah explained. "In Philadelphia, we had proper slates and chalk, but principles of engagement remain the same, regardless of materials." The afternoon session progressed more smoothly, with Sarah reading aloud from a simplified version of Robinson Crusoe that captivated even the most restless children. When the school day ended, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. These frontier children were indeed different from her Philadelphia students, less concerned with decorum, more direct in their questions, and remarkably self-sufficient in many ways. "You survived," Mr. Harrington observed with a tired smile as they straightened the classroom after the children's departure. "Better than most would have. These children can be formidable." "They're curious and energetic," Sarah countered. "With proper direction, those qualities become assets rather than obstacles. A generous assessment." He pushed his spectacles higher on his nose. "The town council meets tonight to review the school's progress. I'd be grateful if you'd accompany me to report on your first day. Having a teacher with Eastern credentials might reassure them about our methods." Sarah agreed, though the prospect of a formal introduction to Pinecrest's leadership brought a flutter of nervousness. She returned to the boarding house to change into her most professional attire, a severe grey dress with modest white collar, and to review her observations from the day. Maggie Cooper provided encouragement over a hasty supper. "The council needs to hear from someone who actually understands children. Half those men haven't spent 10 consecutive minutes with their own offspring." The town hall stood at the center of Pinecrest, its brick facade and white columns suggesting municipal permanence and authority. Inside, a simple meeting room held rows of wooden chairs facing a raised platform where 5 men sat behind a long table. Sarah recognized Edward Wilson immediately, his posture as precise as his neatly trimmed mustache. Beside him sat an older man whose resemblance to Charlotte Hayes marked him immediately as her father, Judge Hayes. The remaining councilmen, a banker, the owner of the lumber mill, and an elderly doctor, completed the leadership of Pinecrest Valley. Sarah took a seat beside Mr. Harrington in the front row, conscious of curious glances from the 24 citizens who had gathered for the meeting. Judge Hayes called the session to order, proceeding through various matters of town business, road repairs, tax collection, and a dispute over water rights before reaching the school report. "Mr. Harrington," Judge Hayes intoned, "the council allocated considerable funds for our new school. We expect commensurate results. What progress can you report?" The young schoolmaster rose, nervously adjusting his spectacles. "Attendance has improved to nearly 80% of eligible children. Reading proficiency is advancing, though mathematical skills remain inconsistent. I've recently engaged an assistant with extensive teaching experience to help with the younger students." He gestured towards Sarah. "Miss Mitchell joins us from Philadelphia, where she taught at Millfield Academy for young ladies." All eyes turned to Sarah as she stood, her height making her conspicuous even in this formal setting. She saw Edward Wilson shift uncomfortably in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Hayes acknowledged with a nod. "Your credentials sound impressive. What are your impressions of our educational efforts?" Sarah had prepared for this question. "The children of Pinecrest show remarkable potential," she began. "They possess a practical intelligence and resourcefulness often lacking in Eastern students. What they need is a curriculum that builds upon these native strengths while introducing formal academic concepts." She outlined her approach with the younger children and her observations about effective teaching methods for frontier students. The council listened with varying degrees of interest. The elderly doctor nodded approvingly, while the banker and mill owner seemed merely polite. Edward Wilson's expression remained unreadable, though his gaze never quite met hers. "Well stated," Judge Hayes concluded when she finished, "though I must inquire, what circumstances bring a teacher from a prestigious Eastern academy to our remote community?" The question, though politely phrased, probed at precisely the information Sarah wished to avoid revealing. She was acutely aware of Edward Wilson's sudden tension. "Personal considerations, Your Honor," she replied with careful composure, "and a desire to contribute to the development of education in frontier regions, which represents America's future." "Indeed," the judge murmured, seemingly satisfied with her diplomatic response. "Well, we welcome your expertise, however temporary your stay might prove." The meeting continued with other matters, and Sarah gradually relaxed, believing the awkward moment had passed. As the session concluded, however, she noticed Charlotte Hayes enter the hall and approach her father, whispering something that caused him to glance in Sarah's direction with new interest. Edward Wilson rose quickly as the meeting dispersed, clearly intending to avoid an encounter. Sarah made no effort to intercept him, equally eager to maintain distance. Instead, she found herself approached by Judge Hayes and his daughter. "Miss Mitchell," the judge said, "my daughter suggests we might benefit from your participation in the library committee. We've recently received a donation of books from Eastern benefactors and need someone with literary knowledge to assist in cataloging and selection." The invitation surprised Sarah. "I'd be delighted to help," she replied honestly. "Literature has always been a particular passion." "Wonderful," Charlotte Hayes interjected with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We meet tomorrow, afternoon at 4, at my father's home. Edward mentioned you were staying at Cooper's boarding house, such a quaint establishment. The subtle emphasis on quaint suggested Charlotte viewed Maggie's establishment as beneath someone of proper breeding. Sarah's opinion of the petite blonde diminished accordingly. "Mrs. Cooper provides exceptional hospitality," she replied, evenly. "I'm fortunate to have found such comfortable lodgings." Charlotte's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, until tomorrow, then." As Sarah and Mr. Harrington walked back toward the center of town, the schoolmaster seemed troubled. "I should warn you," he said hesitantly, "the Hayes family wields considerable influence in Pinecrest. Their invitation suggests interest beyond mere library matters." "What sort of interest?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer involved Edward Wilson. Mr. Harrington adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I wouldn't presume to speculate. I merely suggest caution in any dealings with them." He paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. "You handled yourself admirably today, Miss Mitchell, both with the children and the council. I'm fortunate to have secured your assistance." The simple praise warmed Sarah after the subtle tensions of the council meeting. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I believe we'll make good progress together." Returning to Cooper's boarding house, Sarah found Maggie awaiting her arrival with keen interest. "Well, how did the council receive you?" Sarah described the meeting while Maggie prepared a pot of tea. When she mentioned the invitation to join the library committee, the older woman's eyebrows rose significantly. "Charlotte Hayes doesn't invite newcomers into her circle without purpose," Maggie observed, pouring the steaming tea into cups. "She and Edward had quite the understanding before she departed so suddenly last spring. Her return has set tongues wagging." "Mr. Harrington suggested I exercise caution," Sarah admitted, warming her hands around the teacup. "Wise advice, though. I doubt he understands the full situation." Maggie settled into her chair with a sigh. Charlotte left precisely when Edward began hinting at marriage plans. Some say she found his mercantile business insufficiently prestigious for a Hayes. Others suggest Judge Hayes opposed the match and sent her east to separate them. "And now she's returned just as Edward arranged for a mail-order bride," Sarah concluded. "The timing seems deliberate." "Indeed it does." Maggie's expression turned sympathetic. "You've been caught in the crossfire of a situation not of your making, dear. Charlotte may view you as competition, regardless of Edward's rejection." "That's absurd," Sarah protested. "I have no interest in Edward Wilson, nor he in me." "Nevertheless, you represent a choice he made in Charlotte's absence. Her pride may demand investigation, if nothing else." Maggie patted Sarah's hand. "Just be your forthright self. The Hayes family respects intelligence, whatever their other faults." The following day brought another session with the schoolchildren, who seemed to have accepted Sarah more readily than the town's adults. Her height, initially a source of wide-eyed stares and whispered comments, quickly became merely another fact about their new teacher, less interesting than her stories and methods. By afternoon, Sarah had established a rapport with most of her young charges, particularly a bright-eyed girl named Emma Foster, the doctor's daughter, who demonstrated remarkable aptitude for reading. When school dismissed, Sarah prepared for her meeting with the library committee with a mixture of professional interest and personal wariness. The Hayes residence stood on a hillside overlooking Pinecrest, its white clapboard exterior and columned porch suggesting a southern plantation house transported to the Montana wilderness. Well-tended gardens surrounded the property, and a liveried servant answered the door, ushering Sarah into a parlor that might have belonged in Boston or Philadelphia, with its brocade furnishings and oil paintings in gilded frames. Charlotte Hayes greeted her with practiced charm, introducing the other committee members, the minister's wife, Mrs. Thornton, Dr. Foster, whom Sarah recognized from the council meeting, and a severe-looking woman introduced as Miss Winters, the postmistress. Notably absent was Edward Wilson, though Sarah had half expected to find him included in this gathering. "We're so pleased you've joined us, Miss Mitchell," Charlotte began, once refreshments had been served. "Father has spoken highly of your educational background." The other committee members regarded Sarah with polite interest, their gazes inevitably noting her height, but quickly moving past it with the practiced social discretion of the well-bred. "I understand you have received a book donation," Sarah prompted, preferring to focus on the ostensible purpose of the meeting. "Yes, from the Williamson Foundation in Boston," Charlotte confirmed. "Nearly 300 volumes, most quite recent. Publications. We hope to establish a proper lending library for Pinecrest, raising the cultural standards of our community." "A worthy endeavor," Sarah agreed sincerely. "Has a location been determined?" "The church basement temporarily," Mrs. Thornton explained, "though Judge Hayes has pledged land for a dedicated building once the collection warrants it." These, the discussion turned to practical matters of cataloging and organization, with Sarah contributing suggestions based on her experience with the Millfield Academy Library. As conversation flowed, she began to relax, finding genuine common ground with these women in their shared appreciation for literature and education. The dynamic shifted, however, when Charlotte casually mentioned, "Edward suggested we might incorporate a reading room where gentlemen could gather to discuss business and politics, a more refined alternative to the saloon." Sarah noted the deliberate invocation of Edward's name and the watchful assessment in Charlotte's eyes as she gauged Sarah's reaction. "That sounds practical," she replied neutrally. "Many communities benefit from such establishments." "Edward has such vision for Pinecrest's development," Charlotte continued. "He believes our town could rival Helena within a decade with proper guidance." "Mr. Wilson certainly seems ambitious," Sarah acknowledged, keeping her tone carefully even. A subtle smile played at Charlotte's lips. "We've known each other since childhood. Edward's family and mine were among the first settlers here when Pinecrest was merely a trading post. Our histories are quite intertwined." The implied intimacy of the relationship hung in the air like perfume, noticeable but difficult to directly address. Sarah recognized the tactical nature of the conversation, the way Charlotte was establishing territorial claims while assessing potential threats. "How fortunate to have such long-standing connections," Sarah replied diplomatically. "As a newcomer, I find Pinecrest's sense of community quite remarkable." "Yes, though newcomers often find integration challenging," Charlotte observed with syrupy concern. "Frontier societies can be rather set in their ways." "Perhaps that's why fresh perspectives are occasionally valuable," Dr. Foster interjected unexpectedly, "preventing stagnation." The older man's gaze met Sarah's with subtle approval. "Miss Mitchell, I understand you've been assigned the younger students at the school. My granddaughter Emma speaks quite admiringly of your methods." The conversation mercifully shifted to educational matters, with Dr. Foster revealing himself as a progressive thinker who valued education for both boys and girls. By the meeting's end, Sarah had identified potential allies and obstacles within Pinecrest's social structure. Dr. Foster and possibly Miss Winters in the former category, Charlotte Hayes definitely in the latter. As she prepared to depart, Charlotte detained her with a light touch on her arm. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you'll join us for Sunday dinner this weekend. Father enjoys intellectual conversation, and your educational background would provide a refreshing perspective." The invitation, so at odds with the subtle territorial marking of their earlier exchange, surprised Sarah. "That's very kind, though I've already accepted an invitation to join a naturalist expedition on Saturday and Sunday." Charlotte's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. An expedition? How unusual. With whom, may I ask? Mr. Reed's guide. Service is escorting Professor Lawrence from Harvard to document plant species in the mountain valleys, Sarah explained. He kindly included me given my interest in natural sciences. Thomas Reed. Charlotte's expression shifted to something between amusement and concern. How adventurous of you, though perhaps reconsider the wisdom of such an excursion. Mountain travel can be quite rigorous and occasionally dangerous for those unaccustomed to wilderness conditions. The condescension in her tone sparked a flicker of defiance in Sarah. I look forward to the experience, she replied firmly. Scientific observation has always been a passion of mine. Charlotte's smile turned brittle. Well, do be careful. The mountains don't observe social niceties. Sarah departed the Hayes residence with mixed feelings about the encounter. The library committee itself presented a worthwhile opportunity to contribute to Pinecrest's development and to access books she would otherwise miss. Charlotte's transparent maneuvering, however, suggested complications Sarah had hoped to avoid in her new beginning. Walking back through town as evening approached, Sarah paused at the edge of the main street, where it gave way to the wilderness beyond. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks catching the last golden light, while shadows deepened in the valleys. Something about their solidity and permanence comforted her. They stood, unchanging and majestic, unconcerned with the social machinations of the humans who dwelled in their shadow. They put everything in perspective, don't they? Sarah turned to find Thomas Reed standing nearby, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunset. He wore practical trail clothing and carried a leather satchel that appeared to contain maps or documents. Mr. Reed, she greeted him, oddly pleased by his unexpected appearance. Yes, they do rather dwarf human concerns. Thomas, please, he reminded her with a smile that transformed his weathered features. Just returned from the survey site. Robert mentioned you visited our establishment yesterday. I was exploring the town, Sarah explained. Your young assistant is quite enthusiastic about your work. Thomas chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. Robert exaggerates my virtues considerably. The boy needs more discerning heroes. He gestured toward the mountains. I trust our expedition plans still stand? Professor Lawrence arrived on today's train, full of questions about alpine flora. I look forward to it, Sarah confirmed. Though I've been warned about the rigors and dangers by Miss Hayes, a flicker of something, amusement or perhaps annoyance, crossed Thomas's face. Charlotte Hayes considers a muddy hem the height of wilderness danger. The expedition will be well within your capabilities, I assure you. I was not truly deterred, Sarah clarified. I've never been one to avoid experiences merely because they might prove challenging. Thomas studied her for a moment, his grey eyes thoughtful. No, I don't imagine you would be easily deterred, Miss Mitchell, a quality more valuable in these mountains than any equipment or provisions. The simple observation, delivered without condescension or surprise, warmed Sarah unexpectedly. Will you join us for supper at Cooper's? She found herself asking. Maggie always prepares more than enough. I'd be honored, Thomas replied, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the boarding house. Their matched height allowed for conversation without awkward adjustments or stooping, a simple pleasure Sarah had rarely experienced with men. How was your first teaching day? Thomas inquired as they walked. Frontier children can be rather direct in their assessments. Sarah described her experiences with the younger students, including their initial fascination with her height and subsequent acceptance. Children adapt more readily than adults to differences, she observed. By afternoon, my height was merely another fact about their teacher, like Mr. Harrington's spectacles or Mrs. Thompson's habit of clapping for attention. Children see what is, without society's filters, Thomas agreed. A skill many adults would benefit from reclaiming. Their conversation flowed easily as they reached Cooper's boarding house, where Maggie welcomed Thomas with evident pleasure and set an extra place at the dinner table. The other boarders greeted him with similar warmth, suggesting his visits were not uncommon, despite Charlotte's implication that he moved primarily in wilderness rather than social circles. Over Maggie's excellent beef stew and fresh bread, conversation ranged across various topics: the progress of the railway spur that would soon connect Pinecrest to the main line, the unusually mild autumn weather, and speculation about winter. Snowfall predictions. Thomas contributed knowledgeably to each subject, revealing a breadth of understanding that belied Charlotte's dismissive characterization of him as merely a rugged guide. "Miss Mitchell has joined the Hayes Library Committee," Maggie announced as she served apple cobbler for dessert. "Charlotte has taken a particular interest in our new teacher." Thomas's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes. "The Hayes family collects people of value, like others collect art," he observed, "especially those with Eastern connections and education." "You sound skeptical of their motives," Sarah noted. "Not skeptical, realistic," Thomas clarified. "Judge Hayes has built Pinecrest according to his vision. His daughter shares his ambitions for the town's development, if not always his methods." "And what vision is that?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the underlying currents she had sensed during the council meeting. "Progress defined strictly in Eastern terms," Thomas replied. "Railways, commerce, extraction of resources, all the trappings of civilization, without necessarily its substance." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "Judge Hayes isn't a malevolent man, merely a limited one. He sees the mountains as obstacles to overcome, or resources to exploit, never as entities worthy of respect in their own right." "While you see them differently," Sarah observed. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The Blackfoot called these mountains the backbone of the world. They understood what we've forgotten, that we exist within nature's systems, not above them." The perspective resonated with Sarah, who had often felt similarly about social systems that arbitrarily valued certain physical attributes over others. "Yet you participate in the development," she noted. "Your guide service brings people into these mountains with respect and care," Thomas emphasized. "There's a difference between introducing people to wilderness and exploiting it, between taking what you need and taking everything you can reach." A shadow crossed his face. "I've seen what happens when greed drives development. Streams poisoned by mining runoff, forests clear-cut without thought for renewal, wildlife driven to extinction for short-term profit." His passion for conservation surprised and intrigued Sarah. "These aren't common views in development circles," she observed. "Hence my limited popularity at town council meetings," Thomas replied with a wry smile. "Though Dr. Foster shares many of my concerns, and a few others are beginning to question unlimited exploitation." "The conservation ordinance Peter mentioned last night," Sarah recalled. Thomas nodded. "A modest proposal to protect certain watersheds and wildlife corridors from development. We're presenting it formally next month, though opposition is substantial. From Judge Hayes and Edward Wilson," Maggie interjected. "And others who see immediate profit as the only consideration," Thomas confirmed. "The vote will be close." After dinner, as darkness settled fully over Pinecrest, Thomas and Sarah stepped onto the porch. The night air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and stars crowded the sky in numbers Sarah had never witnessed in Philadelphia. "Amazing, isn't it?" Thomas said softly, following her gaze upward. "No coal smoke or gas lamps to dim their light." "It's beautiful," Sarah agreed, momentarily overwhelmed by the vastness above them. "Makes human concerns seem rather petty," Jade, perspective is the greatest gift wilderness offers, Thomas observed. The mountains don't care about our social hierarchies or arbitrary judgments. They simply are, magnificent in their indifference. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with such judgments. Sarah glanced at him, curious about this man who seemed so at ease with himself, yet somewhat separate from the community he served. "You've lived here long?" she asked. 12 years, Thomas replied. Came west after the war, needed space and silence after too much death. He didn't elaborate on which war or his role in it, and Sarah didn't press. Found. Work as a scout for the army initially, then as a guide for scientific expeditions. Started my own service 8 years ago when Pinecrest was barely more than a trading post. You've seen considerable changes then. Some for the better, some not. Thomas turned from the stars to meet her gaze directly. But change itself is inevitable. The question is whether it happens with wisdom or merely with haste. The statement seemed to encompass more than just Pinecrest's development. Sarah found herself wondering about Thomas Reed's own history, the experiences that had shaped his unusual perspectives and evident self-containment. "I should take my leave," he said after a comfortable silence. "Early start tomorrow with Professor Lawrence's preliminary consultation. For Saturday's expedition, wear your sturdiest boots and layers you can add or remove as temperatures change. I'll provide everything else necessary." "I look forward to it," Sarah replied sincerely. "It will be refreshing to observe nature without social complications." Thomas smiled, the expression warming his typically reserved features. "Nature has its own hierarchies and conflicts, but they're honest ones at least. Good night, Miss Mitchell." "Sarah, please," she corrected, realizing he had consistently used her formal address while requesting she use his given name. "If we're to be expedition companions." "Sarah," he repeated, the simple word carrying a weight of acknowledgement that transcended mere nomenclature. With a respectful nod, he departed, his tall figure gradually blending into the darkness beyond the porch. Lamplight. Watching him go, Sarah reflected on the contrasts between Thomas Reed and Edward Wilson, one comfortable in his skin and convictions, the other carefully curated and concerned with appearances. Between Charlotte Hayes's calculated social maneuvers and Thomas's straightforward conservation ethics, between a community that measured worth by Eastern standards and a wilderness that recognized only authentic substance. For a woman who had never fit conventional measurements, the distinction was not merely philosophical, but deeply personal. Perhaps here, in this place of transition between civilization and wilderness, she might find a path that honored her true nature rather than demanding its diminishment. Inside, Maggie waited with obvious curiosity. "Thomas seems to hold you in high regard," she observed casually. "He rarely shares his conservation views so openly with newcomers." "He's an interesting man," Sarah acknowledged, unwilling to examine too closely the warmth she felt in Thomas's presence. "With unusual perspectives for a frontier businessman." "Thomas Reed is unusual in many respects," Maggie agreed with a knowing smile. "Not least in being the only man in 3 territories who literally sees eye to eye with you." The simple observation, delivered without judgment, named the unspoken truth that had hummed beneath their interactions. The novel experience of conversing with a man without the usual physical awkwardness that Sarah's height typically created. "That's merely coincidence," Sarah protested mildly, though she couldn't deny the comfort of their matched stature. "Perhaps," Maggie conceded, her eyes twinkling, "though coincidences often carry meaning for those willing to recognize it." That night, preparing for the next day's teaching, Sarah found her thoughts returning to the upcoming expedition. Beyond scientific interest, She looked forward to experiencing the wilderness that had shaped Thomas Reed's philosophy, to seeing firsthand the mountains that stood tall without apology or accommodation, secure in their right to occupy the space. They claimed. Perhaps there were lessons there beyond botany and geology, lessons about standing one's full height in a world that often demanded stooping to meet expectations. Lessons she had been seeking, consciously or not, since first recognizing herself as irrevocably different from the conventional ideal. With that thought warming her, Sarah turned to her lesson preparations with renewed focus, determined to give Pinecrest children the education they deserved while finding her own place in this community, poised between past and future, between wilderness and civilization, a community that might, just possibly, have room for a woman who had never quite fit anywhere else. Saturday morning dawned with crystal clarity, the mountains etched sharply against a cobalt sky. Sarah rose early, excitement quickening her pulse as she dressed in the practical attire she had assembled for the expedition. A divided riding skirt borrowed from Maggie, a sturdy blouse, and the most substantial boots she owned. Her anticipation had built throughout the week as she divided her time between teaching duties and the library committee's cataloging work. The Mountaineer Guide Service bustled with activity when she arrived. Professor Lawrence, a middle-aged man with enthusiastic eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, was directing the packing of botanical collection equipment while Robert secured supplies to pack animals. Thomas Reed stood at the center of the preparations, his quiet authority evident in the efficient movement of his employees. "Miss Mitchell, Sarah," he greeted her, his gray eyes warming, right on time. "Let me introduce you to Professor Lawrence." The Harvard botanist clasped her hand with scholarly enthusiasm. "Delighted, absolutely delighted. Thomas mentioned your interest in natural sciences. We're documenting several alpine species that may prove entirely new to science. Your assistance will be invaluable." "I fear my botanical knowledge is rudimentary," Sarah cautioned. "Nonsense," the professor declared. "An educated observer is precisely what we need. Besides, Thomas tells me you're a teacher. Who better? To help record our findings for educational purposes." Thomas approached with a sturdy mare. "This is Maple, steady temperament, smooth gait. She'll serve you well on mountain trails." Sarah assessed the horse with appreciation, noting the well-crafted saddle adjusted for a taller rider. "She's beautiful. She'll match your height better than most mounts," Thomas explained, helping Sarah adjust the stirrups after she mounted. His assistance was practical and respectful, without the awkwardness Sarah typically experienced when accepting help from men. Their party departed Pinecrest just as the town was coming to life. Sarah noticed Charlotte Hayes watching from the milliner's shop doorway, her expression unreadable at this distance. Edward Wilson stood outside his mercantile, pointedly turning his attention to a delivery wagon rather than acknowledging their passage. Once beyond town limits, the landscape opened magnificently before them, expanses of golden meadows giving way to pine forests that climbed the lower slopes of mountains crowned with early snow. The air carried a sweet sharpness, clean and invigorating after Philadelphia's coal smoke atmosphere. Thomas rode beside Sarah, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. His knowledge of the territory was evident in his descriptions, not merely identifying features, but explaining their geological origins, historical significance, or ecological importance. "You've studied this land thoroughly," Sarah observed as they paused to rest the horses beside a clear stream. "It teaches those willing to observe," Thomas replied. "The Blackfoot were my first instructors. 2 feathers showed me how to read the landscape, how watersheds connect, how animal movements indicate ecosystem health, how subtle changes in vegetation reveal altitude and soil composition." The revelation of his indigenous education explained the occasional remarks she'd heard about Thomas's unusual perspectives. Such knowledge isn't typically valued in academic circles, she noted. A serious oversight, Professor Lawrence interjected, overhearing their conversation. Indigenous ecological understanding often anticipates scientific discoveries by generations. I've learned to listen carefully to local knowledge wherever I travel. Their journey continued through changing elevations, entering a high valley by mid-afternoon that took Sarah's breath away with its beauty. Steep rocky slopes embraced a hidden meadow where a lake of impossible blue mirrored the sky above. Yellow and purple wildflowers, improbably vibrant so late in the season, dotted the grassy expanse. Paradise Basin, Thomas announced, one of the areas we're proposing for protection under the Conservation Ordinance. It's extraordinary, Sarah breathed, understanding instantly why this place warranted preservation. The unique microclimate supports plant species found nowhere else, Professor Lawrence explained, already dismounting and reaching for his collection case. Several medicinal plants grow here that the Blackfoot have used for centuries. Their properties are just beginning to interest pharmaceutical researchers. They established camp near the lakeshore, a well-practiced routine that Sarah observed with interest. Thomas selected the site with careful attention to protection from wind, proximity to water, and minimal impact on the fragile alpine environment. When the tents were erected, one for Professor Lawrence, one for Sarah, and another for Thomas and Robert, they began the afternoon's scientific work. Sarah found herself serving as the professor's assistant, carefully pressing plant specimens between paper sheets and recording his observations in a journal. The work absorbed her completely, the precise documentation appealing to her academic nature, while the beauty surrounding them nourished her spirit. As the sun lowered toward the western peaks, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Thomas called a pause to their labors. The light will be gone soon. Perhaps you'd like to see something remarkable before dinner? He led Sarah along a narrow path that climbed above the lake, winding between massive boulders until they reached a promontory overlooking the entire basin. The vista spread before them like a living map, the lake now coppery with sunset reflections, the surrounding forests darkening to emerald, distant peaks flaring with alpenglow. It's breathtaking, Sarah said softly, aware of something expanding. Within her chest, a recognition of magnificence that transcended words. This is why I fight to protect these places, Thomas replied, his voice equally quiet. Some values can't be measured in board feet of timber or ounces of silver. They stood in companionable silence as the light changed, shadows lengthening across the valley floor. Sarah felt an unfamiliar peace settle over her, not merely the absence of social judgment that had followed her throughout her adult life, but a positive presence of acceptance. Here, amid these ancient mountains, her height seemed appropriate rather than anomalous, her perspective valuable rather than inconvenient. "Thank you for including me in this expedition," she said finally. "I've never experienced anything quite like this." Thomas turned toward her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "I hoped you might appreciate what these mountains have to offer. Not everyone does. How could anyone not see the value here? They see different values: extractable resources, developable land, potential profit." A shadow crossed his face. "Judge Hayes views this basin as a potential reservoir site for a hydroelectric project. Edward Wilson sees it as prime location for a hunting lodge catering to wealthy eastern sportsmen. The thought of this pristine landscape, transformed by commercial development, struck Sarah as profoundly wrong. That would be a tragedy. Hence the Conservation Ordinance, Thomas agreed, though its passage remains uncertain. The deciding vote likely rests with Dr. Foster, who recognizes the medicinal value of these plants, but also understands the economic pressures facing Pinecrest. As darkness enveloped the mountains, they returned to camp, where Robert had prepared a hearty stew over the campfire. Professor Lawrence regaled them with tales of botanical expeditions in exotic locations, his scholarly persona giving way to an unexpected gift for storytelling. Later, as Sarah prepared for sleep in her tent, she reflected on the day's experiences, not merely the scientific observations and natural beauty, but the uncommon sense of belonging she had felt among these companions who valued knowledge and conservation above social conventions. For the first time since arriving in Pinecrest, she began to envision a future for herself in this territory, not as anyone's wife, but as an educator and possibly a contributor to conservation efforts. Sunday brought continued exploration. With Professor Lawrence documenting several plant species he declared potentially new to science. Sarah's assistance proved more valuable than she had anticipated, her precise handwriting and organized mind helping to create meticulous records of their findings. By mid-afternoon, when they began the journey back to Pinecrest, Sarah felt transformed in subtle but significant ways. The mountains had offered perspective that Philadelphia's drawing rooms and classrooms never could, a recognition that human concerns, including arbitrary social judgments about physical appearance, paled against the backdrop of geological time and natural grandeur. As they rode, Thomas shared his vision for Pinecrest's development, not opposition to progress, but a balanced approach that preserved wilderness while allowing thoughtful growth. The town stands at a crossroads, he explained. The decisions made now will shape its character for generations. You speak like someone with a personal stake in that future, Sarah observed. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. I've dedicated 12 years to this territory. I'd prefer not to see it sacrificed to short-term profit. He glanced at her. And you? Do you envision remaining in Pinecrest? The directness of the question caught Sarah by surprise. I'm beginning to, she admitted. The teaching position offers purpose, and I find the community interesting. Despite certain complications? Thomas's tone suggested awareness of the social dynamics surrounding her arrival. Those exist everywhere, albeit in different forms, Sarah replied. At least here, there's honesty in most interactions, even difficult ones. They reached town as dusk gathered, a light snow beginning to fall, the first of the season dusting, rooftops and streets with delicate white. Thomas assisted Sarah from her horse with the same unself-conscious respect he had shown throughout their journey. Thank you again, she said, reluctant to see the expedition end, for the experience and the perspective. Both are always available to those who seek them, Thomas replied, his gray eyes holding hers with unexpected warmth. Perhaps you might join us again. The mountains have many lessons to offer. The invitation, simple yet profound, suggested continuity beyond this single excursion. I'd like that very much, Sarah responded, aware of something shifting between them, a recognition of shared values and mutual respect that transcended conventional courtship rituals. The following weeks brought a deepening rhythm to Sarah's life in Pinecrest. Her teaching duties expanded as Mr. Harrington recognized her gift for engaging difficult students. The library committee work progressed with Sarah's literary knowledge, proving valuable in organizing the growing collection. Charlotte Hayes maintained a coolly polite demeanor in their interactions, her initial wariness gradually giving way to reluctant respect for Sarah's educational expertise. Edward Wilson avoided direct encounters, though Sarah occasionally noticed his gaze following her when they occupied the same public spaces. The awkwardness of their initial arrangement seemed to fade into the background of community life, overtaken by Sarah's growing reputation as an educator. Thomas became a regular visitor at Cooper's boarding house, initially bringing books he thought might interest Sarah, then staying for Maggie's suppers and lively conversation. Their connection deepened through shared intellectual interests and conservation values, a friendship developing naturally without the social pressures that typically complicated relationships. The town council meeting where the conservation ordinance would be decided arrived on a bitterly cold November evening. The town hall filled beyond capacity, with ranchers, miners, merchants and townsfolk crowding the chamber. Judge Hayes presided with formal authority, calling for presentations from both sides. Edward Wilson spoke first, outlining economic development, plans that would bring prosperity through resource utilization. His vision for Pinecrest emphasized growth, commerce, and Eastern investment, a future of increasing wealth and prominence. Thomas followed, presenting the conservation perspective with quiet conviction. He displayed maps showing watershed connections, explained wildlife migration patterns, and demonstrated how sustainable practices would preserve resources for future generations. His presentation culminated with watercolor paintings of Paradise Basin and other areas proposed for protection. These places represent our true wealth, he concluded, not for what can be extracted from them, but for what they already are, irreplaceable treasures that define our home. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the community, between immediate profit and long-term sustainability, between Eastern development models and Western conservation ethics. Edward and Judge Hayes argued forcefully against restrictions on progress, while Thomas and his allies emphasized stewardship responsibilities. When Dr. Foster finally rose to speak, the swing vote everyone had been awaiting, the room fell silent. "I've considered both positions carefully," the elderly physician began. "As a man of science, I value evidence. Professor Lawrence's recent expedition documented 17 plant species with medicinal properties in the areas proposed for protection." He nodded toward Sarah. "Miss Mitchell's careful records have helped quantify their potential medical value." Sarah straightened in surprise, unaware her expedition notes would feature in this crucial debate. "These natural pharmacies," Dr. Foster continued, "represent more sustainable wealth than any short-term extraction. I vote in favor of the conservation ordinance." The chamber erupted in mixed reactions. Cheers from conservation supporters, angry murmurs from development advocates. Judge Hayes called for order, officially recording the 3-2 vote in favor of protection. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah found herself approached by an unexpected figure, Charlotte Hayes, her expression composed but thoughtful. "Your expedition records were quite persuasive," Charlotte acknowledged. "Father is disappointed, of course, but perhaps there's wisdom in preserving some areas while developing others." The concession, however limited, suggested a capacity for reconsideration that Sarah hadn't anticipated. "Balance seems the wisest approach," she agreed. Charlotte nodded, glancing toward where Edward stood in intense conversation with Judge Hayes. "Some lessons come at personal cost. I learned that in Boston." Something vulnerable flickered across her carefully maintained composure. "Edward and I had an understanding before I left. My return was perhaps presumptuous." The admission surprised Sarah with its honesty. "We rarely choose where life's path leads us," she offered. "No, but we choose how we walk it." Charlotte's gaze moved to where Thomas stood across the room, his tall figure distinctive in the crowd. "Some find their proper companions through unexpected circumstances. Good evening, Miss Mitchell." She departed with dignified grace, leaving Sarah to consider the unexpected moment of genuine connection between two women whose lives had intersected through no design of their own. Thomas approached, satisfaction evident in his expression despite his reserved demeanor. "A significant victory," he said quietly, "though the work of conservation has only begun." "Congratulations," Sarah replied warmly. "Your perseverance made this possible. Many contributed." Thomas corrected, his gaze finding hers with meaningful intensity. "Including your scientific documentation. Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to discuss." They left the town hall, stepping into a night transformed by snowfall. Flakes drifted silently through lamplit streets, muffling sounds and softening edges. Thomas led them toward the edge of town where the wilderness began, stopping at the precise spot where they had first encountered each other. "I've been considering the future," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Both Pinecrest's and my own. This conservation victory creates possibilities I hadn't dared hope for previously." "What sort of possibilities?" Sarah asked, sensing the importance of this conversation. "The Geological Survey has offered me a position documenting wilderness areas throughout the territory for potential preservation. It would mean extensive travel, mapping regions few have properly explored." He paused, breath visible in the cold air. "It's work I believe in deeply." "It sounds perfect for your skills and convictions," Sarah observed, ignoring a pang at the thought of his departure from Pinecrest. "Almost perfect," Thomas agreed, turning to face her fully. "It lacks just one element." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "A companion who shares both the vision and the perspective." The implication hung in the snowy air between them. Not merely a professional partnership, but something more personal. Sarah felt her heart quicken despite the cold. "Are you proposing an expedition, Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice steady despite her emotional response. "I'm proposing a life," Thomas replied simply. "One shaped by mountains and valleys, by conservation work and educational outreach, by two people who see eye to eye in more ways than merely the physical." The directness of his declaration, free from conventional romantic flourishes, touched Sarah deeply. Here was no superficial attraction or social calculation, but recognition of genuine compatibility and shared purpose. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I've never fit conventional expectations. My height has deterred many who initially expressed interest." "I'm not interested in convention," Thomas responded, a smile warming his features. "I'm interested in you, your mind, your principles, your perspective. Your height is merely the architecture that houses those qualities, like mountains contain watersheds and forests." The unusual comparison made Sarah laugh softly, tension dissolving in genuine amusement. "That's perhaps the most unique compliment I've ever received." "Is it a compliment if it's simply truth?" Thomas asked, his expression growing serious. "Again, I don't pretend romantic expertise, Sarah. I offer partnership between equals, in purpose, in values, and yes, in stature. The question is whether such a partnership interests you." Sarah considered his words, weighing them against her experiences and aspirations. She thought of her initial journey to Pinecrest, seeking Edward Wilson's approval, contrasted with the genuine respect she had found in Thomas's company. She recalled Philadelphia's drawing rooms where she had perpetually stooped to minimize her height, compared to the mountains where standing tall seemed natural and right. "Yes," she said finally, her voice clear in the snowy silence. "Such a partnership interests me very much. Not because we share physical height, but because we share vision and values." Thomas's smile transformed his weathered features. With deliberate care, he took her gloved hands in his. "Then we'll build that future together, standing tall amid these mountains that teach us what truly matters." As snowflakes gathered on their shoulders and the distant peaks disappeared into darkness, Sarah Mitchell found herself exactly where she belonged, not diminished to fit social expectations, but celebrated for her full stature, both physical and personal. The path that had begun with rejection had led to something far more valuable than mere acceptance. It had brought her to genuine appreciation, to purpose, and to a companion who truly saw her. The mountains have much to teach us, she agreed, softly. I look forward to learning those lessons together. Their figures, matched in height and now in purpose, turned toward town. Two tall silhouettes against the falling snow, their shadows stretching behind them like promises of the shared future ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.